people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Okay, we'll start with this. What was Keith Thurman's big win in the land down under early this morning last night, if you're in the southern hemisphere, in Australia, where he stopped Brock Jarvis in approximately 3 rounds after 2 knockdowns. A well-placed uppercut.
That was the first.
And a leaping left hook was the last. To finish off in spectacular fashion, it was Keith Thurman's first knockout win in about a decade, 10 years,
and approximately 104 months.
In what was his first fight in approximately 3 years, after winning a points decision over Mario Barrios in the welterweight division, what was supposed to herald Keith Thurman's comeback that just led to another long hiatus from the sport. These hiatuses are tell-them age when it comes to Keith Thurman. Spent 2 years away from the sport after his win against Danny Garcia, 2 more years away from the sport after he lost to Manny Pacquiao, then 3 more years after his points decision win over Mario Barrios, for a grand total of approximately 7 years of inactivity in the last 10.
Why is he coming back?
It's a golden opportunity for Keith to resurrect his career by being the familiar face on foreign soil, the former champion, in a foray that's not dissimilar from what we saw with TJ Doheny in Japan. He had about 2 or 3 fights out there, garnered a bit of a cult following, a bit of a buzz, albeit in the latter years of his career.
All but done at world level.
But still worth something to a foreign audience, a former champion, a familiar face who you can use to perhaps sell another fight with another fighter. I've long maintained that there is money and there are opportunities outside of America. A Keith Thurman fight in America isn't going to draw anything but to a foreign audience that's
abroad,
only really seen fighters like Keith on their television screen, not having very many opportunities to be there to see him live in action.
And against one of their own, it's got more appeal than him fighting here in America. That may seem strange, that the American fighter might have a bit more appeal outside of America than in it.
When you compare the reception that Keith got for the Barrios fight as opposed to the Brock Jarvis fight, it does seem like the audience was a lot more receptive to the Brock Jarvis fight, and maybe that's because Americans are spoiled.
They don't got a lot of stock in Keith Thurman. Not in his mid to late 30s. They have younger fighters they can take in, like Abdullah Mason and Keyshawn Davis, Shakur Stevenson, and the whole bunch.
Like what you see from old hip-hop acts from the 90s and early 2000s, that in America, they're not what they used to be, but in a foreign country, they still go on tour and they're still able to make money that way. That's what best describes Keith's foray in the Australian boxing market, what is part of a 2 to 3 prong process.
A plan.
Helmed by the good people at No Limit Boxing, No Limit Promotions, who I've often talked about here on the channel the last 4 or 5 years. A well-to-do promotional outfit and a well-oiled machine in the domestic Australian boxing scene that want to put Keith Thurman in the ring with Tim Tszyu in an effort to rehabilitate Tim after a horrific 2024, losing to Sebastian Fundora, then again to Bakram Murtazaliev. It would seem they're taking their foot off the gas.
Here were the 3 prongs.
The first was Thurman versus Jarvis. The second would be Tszyu versus Spencer.
And the third would be the fight between them, that if Keith holds up his end of the bargain and Tim holds up his, they'll have a showdown between them this summer. Given how injury-prone Keith Thurman has been throughout his career, you do have to wonder if he's going to make it there.
But so far, so good. He's held up his end of the bargain, saying, I just raised the bar on you, Tszyu. If you want to come back, you've got to come back hard, baby.
Hard.
A few realities in association with this 3-pronged process, this plan. You can't read too much too much into Keith Thurman knocking out Brock Jarvis because Brock Jarvis really isn't that good. This is a guy that used to campaign at 135, but he got too big, so he moved up to 140, got knocked out by Liam Paro, then decided to jump up 2 weight classes to campaign as a junior middle. That you really can't look at Brock as being a bona fide junior middleweight
so much as a guy who got too big for junior welter.
That conundrum, and what was the ideal comeback fight for a 36 or 37-year-old former champion. That even though Keith Thurman has been out for 3 years, Brock Jarvis is pretty shit.
Yeah, that guy sucks.
If you are now thinking to yourself that Keith Thurman is back, Keith Thurman is all the way back, restored to his former glory, don't put the cart before the horse. All he did was knock out Brock Jarvis, who was already knocked out by Liam Paro.
Realities.
For this 3-pronged process to be the trifecta it is intended to be, Thurman-Tszyu must make it past Joey Spencer. Don't forget who's paying for all of this. Don't forget who's at the helm of the promotion. For this to be as lucrative as it can be, it's gotta be Thurman versus Tszyu.
Not simply Thurman versus the winner. For the money to be there, it's gotta be Thurman versus Tszyu because it's Tszyu, Tim Tszyu, that No Limit is invested in.
Understand that. There's no money in Thurman versus Spencer, Joey Spencer. You don't come back to America and bill that as some kind of big-time fight. It wouldn't be. For it to be a big-time fight with a big-time payday, it's got to be Thurman versus Tszyu in Australia.
Pretty sure they're paying Keith Thurman well to come out there.
Not astronomical money per se, good enough to draw him out, and more than he would make rolling the dice here in America.
Tim's gotta beat Joey.
Now, Joey Spencer is pretty shit. I mean, he's pretty bad in and of himself. But Tim Tszyu had a horrific year last year, and you wonder that the ghosts of last year won't still be haunting him April 6th when this fight goes down.
3 weeks.
We don't yet have the broadcast info as to who's going to air this fight in America, but I imagine it'll be a similar situation to what we saw this morning, to where the fight was not shown on Amazon Prime via PBC's Amazon deal. It was shown on their YouTube channel.
Wow.
From this deal's inception, I've long maintained that Amazon is not remotely invested in what PBC has to offer their platform, including foreign broadcast rights.
It's just a hub. Somewhere for them to distribute their shows, but Amazon is not invested.
It's tantamount to letting your neighbor borrow the lawnmower.
Pretty much.
So when Keith Thurman's latest ring appearance ends up on YouTube instead of Amazon Prime, what does that communicate? What does that say? And I think that Thurman-Tszyu's fight will also end up on their YouTube channel.
Still a good situation for Keith, though.
A gamble, if you will, a roll of the dice, venturing outside of your comfort zone, outside of America, to a foreign market to make money over there.
This was a pay-per-view.
Keith Thurman is not pay-per-view worthy in America by any stretch of the imagination, but in a foreign market, it's different.
May seem strange, but that's how it breaks down.
So it is. It's all build up for a big Thurman-Tszyu showdown this summer. So Keith showed some shades of his former self. The lateral movement, the accuracy, and some power is there. Some, at least enough to knock out Jock Jarvis, but like I said, don't read too much into it, because this guy already got knocked out at 140.
If a Keith Thurman can't knock out a guy like this, then he don't need to be boxing.
Thurman versus Tszyu was supposed to happen in America last year, but Keith Thurman reportedly became injured and Sebastian stood in his place. It never made sense to me for Thurman-Tszyu to come here for that fight with Keith, when in fact it's bigger over there.
Would seem they wised up.
It's a bigger fight over there. It's actually box office worthy over there. Now they mean to do it with seemingly limited involvement from the PBC, because this is not their party.
Keith Thurman, once heralded as the PBC's flagship fighter, one of their flagship fighters that represented the golden era of PBC boxing. Better times.
More fertile, now reduced to being the road warrior, but it's working for him.
Even if they've fallen on hard times here stateside, Keith Thurman has found some success traveling abroad to resurrect his career, at least momentarily, because I don't think this is a full-on junior middleweight title run. He's just making money where he can.
There's an opportunity there, and he was smart enough to capitalize on it. Congratulations to him.
Now Timmy's got to make it past Joey, and we'll see what happens.
everyone's taking Al's blueprint, but they just tweaked because they didn't want to be the one being sued, right? Like Al was met with resistance when he tried to do what everyone else is doing. They learned from his mistake. They learned how to not get sued and how to not violate the Muhammad Ali Act. What the freak is the difference between Al Haymon using his $500 million to overpay fighters to fight on his side of the street when Eddie turned around and did the same thing with his $1 billion, and then Turkey turned around and did the same thing with his unlimited funds? But Eddie wasn't met with resistance. He was looked at as a great guy, and Turkey was labeled a savior and injected into the Hall of Fame. Meanwhile, Al was sued.
Al was sued because he blew all of Waddle and Reed's money.
And Al was sued in suspicion for being in violation of the Muhammad Ali Act by acting as both manager, promoter, and advisor to a good number of those PBC fighters. That's why he was sued, and that's not what Eddie Hearn has been doing. That's not what Turkey has been doing.
Let's poke some holes in this thing. Let's poke some holes in this argument that Nestor of the Boxing Voice is making to make Al Haymon seem like he was unjustly persecuted, unfair, and now people are taking his blueprint?
The blueprint to what? Be an abject failure?
There is so many differences between what Al Haymon's intentions were, what he did when he started out, what Eddie did when he got here, and what Turkey is doing. It's almost like you're deliberately leaving out all the nuance to make it seem equivocal.
It's a false equivalency argument.
Al Haymon gets that $500 million from Waddle and Reed, and it wasn't to invite Top Rank or Golden Boy to the barbecue or their fighters. It was Al Haymon's intention to isolate himself from everyone else, where that's not what Eddie Hearn did. That's not what DAZN did. They sent offers to everybody's fighters. Al Haymon didn't do that.
DAZN was willing to work with everybody and their fighters. They sent offers to the PBC's guys and Gervonta and Jermall Charlo.
They wanted to do Lomachenko versus Haney, which involved Top Rank, and they did do Hooker versus Ramirez, which involved Top Rank. They were willing to work with everybody, where Al Haymon was not. So, to what blueprint are you referring to? Because Eddie and DAZN didn't do what Al Haymon did.
Turkey isn't doing what Al Haymon did. Turkey's literally working with everybody, including Al Haymon's fighters.
To suggest that these three guys were all doing the same thing the same way is a false equivalency argument seemingly intended to make Al Haymon look persecuted, treated unfairly.
You said that they were accepting of Eddie Hearn when he first got here? That they viewed him as a good guy? They were not accepting. Everybody tried to run him out of town. Oscar, Bob, the guys at the PBC, the fans too.
How many times did you see Leonard Ellerby shitting on the DAZN platform, taking shots at DAZN, calling it dead zone? What are you talking about?
That they were accepting of Eddie, or that they are now accepting of Turkey? There are people who aren't.
No matter how good the fights are that he puts together, and no matter how affordable he makes it to the consumer, there are still people taking shots at him. There are still people that don't like him. Right here in America. So what are you talking about? You make it seem like they were so mean to little Al.
So unfair. They were like that with Eddie. They're like that now with Turkey.
Talking about Al Haymon's blueprint. Everybody's borrowing his blueprint? What blueprint is that? How to burn through $500 million and have nothing to show for it?
How to get kicked off of 3 major broadcasters and make boxing in America seem like a hot potato to the networks?
Lou DiBella talked about this to some extent on his recent visit with Ariel Helwani.
And as soon as people got all these exclusive deals, what else happened? They didn't work with other people. They tried to create their own thing.
Right.
And it became even a greater impediment. How many times did you hear the old saying, the other side of the street, the other side of the street?
Yeah.
Fuck that other side of the street. You destroyed your own business. You didn't make the big fights because you were operating your own company. It was every man for himself. And we sort of deserved to be here. And I made money in the system also. I mean, to be honest, I was never big enough to change the system. I'll say this. There was a promoter summit 10, 15 years ago where everyone was in a room. And I prognosticated a lot of shit. I said HBO's not going to stay in. Showtime's not going to stay in. We're not going to be able to sustain the same kind of success we've had if we don't start working together. Honestly, working together to the point that we could create a television property with a promoters association, self-govern.
The environment that Lou DiBella is describing is a direct byproduct of Al Haymon's PBC and their unwillingness to work with other promoters that are out there. The fragmentation of boxing.
When they started, It wasn't so that they could make fights with Top Rank, and it wasn't so they could make fights with Golden Boy. You had Golden Boy and Top Rank fighters on HBO, PBC guys on Showtime.
Al Haymon gets that $500 million from Waddle and Reed, and it's so that he can do his own thing within his own borders. Whether or not you want to hold that against him is up to you, but that's the way it was. He wasn't trying to work with the other outfits.
Sides of the street talk, that started on the PBC side of the street, when Errol Spence famously said, Terrence is on the wrong side of the street.
And as stated, whether or not you want to hold it against Al Haymon that he was trying to do his own thing, that's up to you, but it did have an effect that affected everyone, the entire boxing landscape in America. It's tantamount to Yankee games happening on Fox and Red Sox games happening on Channel 7.
Except that one of the franchises is saying, that other team is on the wrong side of the street, so we're not going to play them, and as a result, the fans don't get a World Series.
Now obviously, Major League Baseball doesn't operate that way, but for a number of years, boxing did.
To its own detriment.
Thus, the fans didn't get fights like Lomachenko versus Mikey Garcia, or Lomachenko versus Gervonta Davis.
As soon as they should have, when those fights were hot. I understand Gervonta reached out to him recently, now that he's an old man and he's talking about retiring because he has back problems.
They didn't get Gervonta versus Lomachenko when they should have. They didn't get Gervonta versus Tevin Farmer when Matchroom reached out to try to do that unification match. They missed out on a lot of fights.
That's on the PBC, it's not on anybody else.
Don't pretend it was. That if Spence versus Crawford took 5 years to put together, who's the guy that said Bud was on the wrong side of the street?
The PBC guy.
So that when you finally do it, now that Top Rank is not involved, it's not as hot as it used to be, and a lot has happened. You can blame the PBC for all of that. So when I see Nestor Gibbs...
When I see anybody liken Al Haymon to some kind of mastermind, he laid out some kind of blueprint. A blueprint to what? Ruin?
Al Haymon was in attendance for the sit-down meeting between Deontay Wilder and John Skipper for what was supposed to be the Anthony Joshua undisputed title fight, a fight that I think would have broke records on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. It didn't happen.
Worth an estimated $100 million to Deontay Wilder, who was advised not to take it by Al Haymon, who subsequently severed ties with Lou DiBella right after that for setting up that meeting.
For trying to make it happen.
When I see anybody talk about Al Haymon being some kind of an architect to what? Destruction?
Newsflash, guys. Boxing is doing just fine in the UK, and Japan, and Australia, and Mexico, and everywhere else. It's in America where it's suffering, where it's in decline.
You don't think that Al Haymon chasing not one, not two, but 3 major networks away, you don't think that has anything to do with that?
He tried to create a self-sustaining bubble for himself and his fighters to not have to work with anybody else. And the entire American domestic boxing scene suffered for it because it's one sport.
It's one audience, irrespective of how many promoters there are.
If he is some kind of master planner, he must have been planning boxing's ruination in this country.
It's the only thing he did.